topic is very near and dear to my heart. I currently work with the immigrant and refugee population in the greater Dayton area. I coordinate an English language learning program for the Brenner Literacy Center. So I will shamelessly recruit anyone who is interested in tutoring immigrants or refugees in Dayton. Afterwards, I'll give you my card, and I will happily hook you up with someone who wants to practice their English and have greater access to the culture and other opportunities they find here. I have also been an immigrant in several different countries because of the work that I do. I've done teaching, teacher training all over the world, Japan, Denmark, Chile, most recently in Spain. So I know what it feels like to be in a country where you either don't speak the language or are not literate in the language, and how difficult it is to learn a new language or two or three as an adult. But it can be done. Okay, so the agenda that I have for today, I thought it would be important to acknowledge that the land we are on in Ohio and Yellow Springs and most of the United States, if not all, was inhabited when the settlers, colonizers came. There were several indigenous nations already living here, and I'll talk a little bit about what the rationale was for removing them. I'll also give a little background on Yellow Springs, when it was founded, when it was incorporated, who did it, for what purposes, because that contributes to the kind of culture that we have here. And then I'll look at the data. So I pulled a lot of data from the Census Bureau, and we'll look at population changes, and it's always important when you're looking at population changes of small populations to put them within the context of the larger populations in which they are living. So I'm looking not only at Yellow Springs population changes, but also the state of Ohio and the nation as a whole. So I went back to 1900 through 2020 for those data. So we'll take a look at what has changed, what remains the same. And then I wanted to focus in on specifically, since we are all, in a sense, migrants to this area, to this land, I wanted to look at what about the newcomers who have been born in other countries? And what about the people who speak a variety of languages that are not English at home? And what's the difference between those two populations? Because I was surprised that they are not equal. So we'll talk about why that might be. And then finally, to give a more personal look into who has chosen to move here to Yellow Springs, who was born in another country. And what was their life like when they lived here? What did they contribute to Yellow Springs? And what did Yellow Springs contribute to them? So with that, we'll move on. So if you go to Ancient Ohio Trail online, it was the group that was instrumental in getting UNESCO World Heritage listing for the Hopewell Earthworks in Ohio. So they have some excellent resources on who was living in Ohio at the time of the Removal Act, which was 1830. It was passed federally, and it was implemented here in Ohio a little bit later, and over about a 10-year period. So I'll get into that. But these were the tribes that were here in 1830. Each of these has a link from the Ancient Ohio Trail. You can go to the present-day websites of each of these tribes. So they are alive, they're well. Chief Glenn Wallace of the Shawnee came back to Ohio Ohio brought several of her members with her when the UNESCO World Heritage Site application was going through. It was very important to the group in Ohio who was seeking that recognition to have current involvement with current tribes who have their roots in Ohio. So those, I think it's fascinating what all they are doing. There's language revitalization, there are cultural celebrations and teaching that are going on today. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. This will unfortunately sound a little too familiar. Andrew Jackson campaigned on the removal of the Indian nations. So he was elected in 1828 and he passed the Removal Act 2 very short years later. And it was implemented in Ohio beginning in fall of October of 1832, which meant that this other Trail of Tears, the Trail of Tears tends to just refer to the Cherokee Nation, but in this case in Ohio there are many more tribes also affected by this. So it's the other Trail of Tears, and I'll give some references later about the professor who wrote the book called The Other Trail of Tears, specifically about the removal process in Ohio. There's also an excellent WISO program devoted to the Ohio country. Specifically, episode 8 is on the removals in Ohio. So it's just a gold mine of resources of the accounts of that removal, which were well documented. They are in the Library of Congress. They are accessible to anyone. Both the tribes who were affected kept documentation, as well as the military members who had been assigned this task of removing them. So there are all kinds of first-person accounts of what that was like, but October quickly turned to winter, and they were walking 600 miles in that winter climate. So as you can imagine, thousands of them perished. Okay, this Chief Billy Friend is the chief of the Wyandot Nation. All of these quotes come from that WISO program on the removals, and feel free to read this at your leisure. They're long quotes, I apologize, but I thought it was just so meaty and substantive what they were describing about the process. So Billy Friend, Chief Billy Friend, is also a Methodist pastor, and so he was talking about the arrival of the Methodist Church in Ohio, and that many of the Wyandot became pastors themselves or joined the Methodist Church. They also became lawyers, they became farmers. One was a postmaster of Upper Sandusky Post Office. So they ended up what he calls acculturating, not assimilating. So they added another culture to their repertoire and participated very actively in the arriving culture. So the reference that I gave earlier, The Other Trail of Tears, is by Dr. Mary Stockwell. So she talks about how even though these nations acculturated actively and educated themselves in the new culture, that did not, in fact, protect them from being removed. Andrew Jackson's biography, in fact, to his dying day, he did not regret that decision. His justification was that the tribes that remained in Ohio were suffering a great deal of bigotry, abuse, and assault on their property, on their person, and it was his view, or the argument that he made, was that removing was a protection for both the Native American nations as well as the local settlers and colonizers. There are other views. So Dr. Rebecca Wingo, she's in close contact with the current day Wyandot Nation, and so she talks about what it was like in Ohio. To Ohio legislators' credit, they fought, the senators, the congresspeople, they fought against the Federal Indian Removal Act being passed. They did not prevail, but the feeling was that in the northern part of Ohio, even in Andrew Jackson's own political party, there was no support for this removal act. It was the Southerners in Ohio who supported it. But they didn't have a lot of day-to-day contact with the tribes that remained, who were located up near the Cleveland area on a reservation. So the offer that Jackson and other Ohio legislators made to new settlers and colonizers was that that land that was currently occupied by the tribal nations would be freed up for the colonizers, and the Indian nations would be fine just on the other side of the Mississippi. That was how it was pushed through. But people lined up on the banks of the river in Cincinnati to watch the Indian nations leave. So there was a sense of that it was incredibly tragic what was happening, and also that it was inevitable because of manifest destiny and this notion that some people belong on this land and some people do not, and that they could decide who that was. Okay, so shifting into the early 1800s, so you can see the founding of Yellow Springs in context is just a few years before the Indian Removal Act passes. So there are about 100 families who follow William Mills and Robert Owen specifically, who was a rather charismatic religious leader and had notions of creating a utopia here. Maybe he succeeded, I don't know. And then the Little Miami Railroad was completed in 1846, so there was a sudden influx of newcomers to the area. The college was founded in 1850 and then opened for students with Horace Mann at the helm in 1853. So it's interesting to me to see who it is that starts a culture or a new colony settlement, and what are the motivating reasons for them to be here, to move here. And we see over and over again in our history an attraction to religious organizations, religious groups, where they are free to come and practice and worship as they wish, and also a lot of education. A very strong college town from the very beginning of the founding. So to compare to what we're going to see in these data from the 20th, I'm dating myself. The 20th and the 21st century. I'm going to do a very quick wrap-up of what was happening before we get to the census data that I'm going to talk about in greater detail. So the early immigration patterns that we'll see are that right around colonial times, most of the newcomers coming to this area were from Great Britain and Ireland, but there are also some who come from Germany, from France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, so these areas. Then into the early 19th century, increasing numbers of German immigrants come in, and the data that I had from 1920 shows a significant number of Germans and German speakers in the township, Miami Township. That was the smallest unit I could get to from that time period. But most of them are farmers if they list an occupation. Many of them are widowed or elderly and living in households with younger children that are supporting them. And there are a couple of exceptions. Women don't have an occupation listed except for a couple of women who were supporting their elderly mother. They were German speakers. One was a nurse, the other was a dressmaker. So I thought, oh, this is so cool. After farm laborer, farmer, we have a couple of other occupations. Then, from 1850 to 1882, a lot more newcomers are coming in from China. They're fleeing famine from their homeland, and they're coming to the U.S. to work in the mining camps and also on the railroad, to expand the railroad. However, there is a backlash, supposedly because in those industries, the Chinese newcomers were accepting much lower wages than those settlers who had been here for a while already. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and that curtailed a lot of immigration from China at that point. 20 years after the Civil War, we'll see more newcomers coming in from Canada and from Italy. Interestingly, in the census data, Italians and Irish before them are listed as non-white. So if you're looking at racial and ethnic categories, it's interesting to keep in mind that the census data categories change over time. So whoever the immigrant group is that the country is not too thrilled about having, they will be listed in a non-white racial category. Finally, after World War II, we see a lot more German immigrants, and fortunately, one of the obituaries that I'll talk about at the end, you can see why exactly all these Germans were coming, at least to our area, and it's very interesting. In the 70s, and we see that here in Yellow Springs as well, there are more Asian and Latin American immigrants, that the numbers are starting to increase at that point. Okay, so unfortunately, the U.S. population is massive in comparison to poor little Ohio and Yellow Springs down here at the very bottom. But you can see there's a steady increase, albeit looking rather small on the state level. Yellow Springs goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down, and on my next slide will show you what the percent change is for these populations, whereas the U.S. continues to go up and up and up. And importantly to remember, since our domestic population in the United States is roughly at replacement levels, the increase in population and the economic growth that tends to accompany these population growths are due to immigration. percent change gives you a little bit better idea on a percentage scale what happens. You couldn't see what was happening to Yellow Springs, but clearly the 60s and the 70s were our high point in terms of population. Those of us who moved during that period will remember how many kids were in school with us, how many people were here, and so that jives with personal experience. I thought it was interesting to know, though, on the state level and the national level, there isn't the same boom. There is an increase, but it's not as significant in such a small population. Small changes, small populations look big, but it's still important to note it has a big impact on us. And then you can see us sort of coming back a little bit to come to where more or less the state level increase scale, the magnitude, is similar. So where are people coming from? The total foreign-born, and I'm using the same category that the census uses, just so if you want to track down some of these numbers or dig in more deeply, I kept it at regional areas, but if you're interested in specific countries, you can look deeper into which countries are contributing the most in these specific regions. The census calls them foreign-born. That nomenclature's kind of gone out of style, but here we are. Got to find the data. So you can see 2000 census data is in this blue bar. Then 2010, I'm using decennial data, is in the orange bar. And finally, 2020, our most recent decennial census, is in green. So you can see the contributing continents or regions. The totals are here, so you can see the progression, the progressive increase in foreign-born in the whole United States. And then where they're coming from, also these increases in Latin America and, from Latin America, from Asia, and Europe is holding relatively steady. Then in Ohio, for comparative purposes, we can see also the total number of foreign-born is on the rise, or has risen over the last 30 years. But many more from Asia come to Ohio. And some Latin American, but if you look at Ohio census data, a lot of our, for example, Spanish-speaking newcomers are from Puerto Rico. So they will not show up in these data. In the northern part of Ohio, the predominant number of Spanish speakers are going to be from the Caribbean and Puerto Rico, whereas in the south of Ohio, we tend to have more people coming from Mexico and now Central America. So it's an interesting breakdown in the state. We've got more Africans. I know that our students in the Dayton area, many of them are coming from Africa, primarily Senegal and the Congo, but also other countries, Rwanda, for example. But I thought it was interesting to see the decrease in Europeans over the same time period. And then here in Yellow Springs, what we're seeing, now remember these are much smaller numbers. Our total population was around 3,500. So keep in mind, these numbers are going to be in the hundreds and less as a total. And then they will break down into just a few people. And but anyway, you can see more Europeans in 2010 and more Asians at the beginning of the millennium in 2000. So a little bit different, or a little more a stronger number coming to Yellow Springs than Ohio as a whole. So I alluded previously to the languages spoken at home, so I'll start with the summary slide just to let you know. The total population in 2000, 2010, and 2020 is here of people who speak other languages at home. And this is the number of people who speak English only, so monolingual English speakers. And then the number is visibly increasing of those who speak languages other than English at home. So what are they? So in the total US, we can see that Spanish is far and away the most spoken language in the home. But because the number of people speaking Spanish at home is higher than the number of people born in Spanish-speaking countries, what this means is that there are a lot of people, citizens born here in the US, who are speaking other languages besides English at home, with their families, with their significant others. So as a language teacher, I was very excited by these data. So you can see in 2010, other Indo-European languages, right, are on the rise, but Asian and Pacific Island languages are really significant. There's a steady increase in other Indo-European languages, but you can see a marked increase in Asian and Pacific Islander languages. So in Ohio, it's a bit different. So you can see the languages other than English. There are many fewer speakers in Ohio than in the United States as a whole. Not a huge surprise, but it's proportional to the group size. So the vast majority of speakers in Ohio are monolingual English speakers. But when they are speaking another language at home, they tend to be speaking other Indo-European languages, but you can see again this increase in Asian and Pacific Islander languages, also in Ohio. And in Yellow Springs, the summary data is quite similar to the state of Ohio as a whole. And we can see specifically a significant drop in the number of other Indo-European languages spoken, but a holding rather steady of the increase in Asian and Pacific Islander languages that we saw from 2000 to 2010. So it's interesting, especially since another of our obituary data has a backstory in this. So I thought I would close by talking about a few of the newcomers to Yellow Springs specifically, why they came, what they did during their lives, and the contributions, the mutual benefits that we've seen in the community and that we've seen in their lives specifically. So Detlef Frank, like his parents, was born in Germany. There are a lot more Germans in Miami Township, starting all the way back in the 20s to now, than I expected. I thought it would be more Irish and English, but in fact we have a lot of German speakers here. So his father was recruited to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as one of the scientists integral to the rocket development in his home country. And this particular operation or project, Paperclip, attracted not only research scientists, but also intelligence officers. So you will also see Russians coming to the U.S. as part of this program who served in the secret police or were spies. They came over as well. So I thought this was a fascinating piece of history on a larger scale, and yet has an impact immediately on our small scale as well. So Detlef grew up here, although he was born in Germany, and my husband and I met him because he was such an amazing person, very outgoing. You'll see his love of soccer. We met on the soccer fields. My husband and he refereed a lot of soccer games as our kids were growing up. So it was wonderful to have that contact and to see his dedication to something that he helped start here in Yellow Springs. He was one of the first participants in the local soccer league, both at the schools, in the school system, as well as recreationally. So what did he do? He got his education here in the U.S. At St. Bonaventure for a BA and a master's at Michigan State, and then he pursued doctoral studies at the University of Chicago, and then taught physics at University of Chicago Lab School. But here in the Dayton area, he worked for NCR. So after NCR, then he returned to teaching, and he was an amazing teacher. So I thought, oh, well, this is a good insight into one of the German immigrants who was recruited as part of that project. This is tiny print, I apologize. Also, someone I knew personally. So this is not a random sample of people. These are obituaries of people that I knew. So when I grew up here in the 70s, 80s, these people loomed large in my life, and that of my husband, who is a little bit older than I, so was in high school in the 70s, I was in the 80s. So interestingly, this family was affected by the internment camps. And so she was born in Manchuria, but studied Japanese and married a Japanese man and had children, but then he was killed in the war. And so her family moved, and eventually she got a job in Kagoshima, where she met her second husband, love of her life, and he was part of the Foreign Diplomat Corps for the U.S. Army, or the U.S. Armed Forces, excuse me. And so they married and had another child together later, Chris Kakahashi, who went to high school with my husband in the 70s. So I know this family very well as well. The Heatons also are related, so anyone familiar with journalism in town will know that there was an impact here that was very strong. But also just creativity and art and connection. Yasuko, or Kaki, was talking about how difficult it was for her to learn a second language, even though she had learned Japanese as a second language, but to add another that uses obviously a completely different alphabetic system and has a no tonal, lexical tones, completely different linguistic family. But because she worked as a seamstress, she had people coming and going all the time and was able to have access to the local culture. Because she had a skill that was highly valued, and she was sought after. So, let's see, her husband ended up working for Vernay Labs. So again, we have the attraction of the scientific community here and the jobs that they provided during that time period. And finally, Oceania was not well represented in the census data, but we did have Oceania residents, Oceania newcomers. So Dr. Alex Roche was born in Healesville, Australia, and again, part of the scientific community here in Yellow Springs. So he joined the Fels Research Institute and was the lead, or became the lead in the Fels longitudinal study. That is still ongoing. So I thought it would be helpful to have an idea of what all is contributed by the newcomers who come to Yellow Springs, to Ohio, but also in the obituaries they speak so glowingly of what they received in return, of being included, being generously embraced by the community. There were a couple of comments in Detla Frank's obituary about Yellow Springs was the only place they felt safe after World War II to come and raise a family, that there was a lot of antagonism against Germans after World War II, and they felt that Yellow Springs was not threatening for them. So I think that's important to take into account, that even now, welcoming the stranger has great effects for the local community as well as the newcomer themselves. So thank you. That concludes the presentation portion of the program, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any about the data or the people I've mentioned here.
I have a lot of questions, but the first one, the Owenites, I had always thought that the Owenites showed up, it didn't work out, and they all went away, and they had no lasting impact on Yellow Springs. But your slide kind of implies that some of them stuck around.
Well, it was a founding contribution. But, you know, the religious groups that were here, like the Congregational Church was very instrumental in Antioch's founding and fell in influence after that. So the point I was trying to make is that Yellow Springs has been perennially attractive to religious groups. Whether they stay or not, but we certainly still have a Quaker presence. And during the Underground Railroad and the abolition movement, they had a strong impact. So I think throughout our history, the group has changed, but whatever it is that the community offers.
Often heard references to people that it was founded by socialists, and it's somehow reflective of the community currently, which I think is complete nonsense. But I wondered if you had any evidence in that regard.
Well, I mean, I think having lived in a democratic socialist country in Europe for many years, I'm a little mystified by the ever-changing definition of socialism in the United States. So technically, economically, politically, there is no evidence for socialism at any part in our history. Until now, when the government has just purchased stock, you know, a stake in a corporation. So that's, you know, that tends to be a hallmark feature of a socialist government, is that many of the corporation or private companies become nationalized and then controlled by the government, like we see in Venezuela and the petroleum company. But I don't see that here on any grand scale.
Another project recently jumped into the Connect family. Waller Connect was actually an assistant soccer coach when high school soccer started in the 70s. I found a photo of the team, which I didn't know. And I I talked to Horst Gienap. I don't know if you know the Gienap family.
No.
He was in the class of '60, and his father, I don't know if he came with that group to write Pat or separately. He's coming back for his 65th reunion next weekend.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know the local soccer program started, I think it was Mr. Robinson, Joe Robinson, when he had come back from being stationed I think he was in the UK and fell in love with soccer in Europe and came back and started the program here, but he had a lot of support.
And Lee Morgan
from
did
locals.
a year abroad when he was in high school, and when he came back, I think so he and Deb kind of got together.
Yeah, so having that sort of critical mass of people from cultures where the beautiful game was already played and was already a value meant that it was easy to kick off the program here in Yellow Springs way before the state of Ohio really embraced it. So Yellow Springs women's soccer won the state in the 70s because they had been playing soccer since they were kids. And the teams they were playing against from much larger communities did not have the same background.
Jocelyn, how easy is that census data to use or create beautiful graphs like that?
Oh my gosh. Well, so it used to be that you could get a lot of the decennial censuses online, but now it's just back to 2000. So you can get 2000, 2010, 2000, or 2020. Those are pretty easily accessible. As soon as you go earlier than 2000, you have to dig. So I got a lot of reports from the Census Bureau on 1990, 1980, but for foreign-born data, there's a gap. So right after the war, 50s and 60s, they were not collecting those data on foreign-born. So they're just not there, which is why I focused on what I could get consistent data on for all of the communities that I was looking at. But Ancestry.com through the library, you can get access to the actual census forms, which was so fun. That's where I got the 1920 census data, where you can, look up their household members, the occupations, how old, so the birth date, the immigration year that they came. It was really fascinating, but the categories are not super consistent with those that come after. So, for example, I had to look at township data for 1920, 1930. I think 1940 it shifted, but they just didn't have data, at least in the long form, that you could access that looked at Yellow Springs separately from Clifton Village. So
Yellow Springs has expanded over the years, so Allen Street was in the township back in 1930, maybe 1940.
it has.
I've downloaded all the Miami Township and Yellow Springs data.
Yeah. It's still fascinating. Yeah, because I mean, you can not just look at the transcript of the record, you can open up the long form, and see the line where they're filling out the data. So that's kind of fun. But it is a considerable amount of time that you have to devote to chase down the pre-World War II census data. After World War II, it's in the archives through the Census Bureau, so you can get PDFs of all the data tables, but then you have to transfer those into an Excel spreadsheet, or that's what I did. I just transferred everything to an Excel spreadsheet, so then I could do my little data displays.
A lot of work.
So, they're so fun. Yeah.
I don't have a question, I was just gonna mention, when you talked about Germans feeling like it was safe here, in looking back through my ancestry thing, I found a number of people, and this is more like Pennsylvania, areas of Pennsylvania, and I know for a fact certain people came from Germany, but on the census, they would actually write that they were French.
Huh.
Just,
Interesting.
it was after the war. So they didn't feel comfortable with people around them knowing that they were German.
And some of the German respondents would give Bavaria instead of Germany, and maybe that played a role as well.
I have my wife's grandfather was born in Finland in Vasa. Anyway, it's about 30% Swedish because the Swedes conquered them 200 years ago and they're so large. And he was always said to be Swedish by her family. And I looked it up and I looked at some of the old census forms since he migrated, I think, in the 1880s. And one year it said he was born in Russia because Russia had dominated Finland at that particular time. Then the next time, maybe vice versa, he was in Finland, but he was always known as Swedish. He spoke Swedish.
Yeah.
So you have to be kind of
The first.
careful about that stuff.
That's the thing. I mean, geopolitical boundaries shift, but language and culture can persist for generations afterward. My mom was part of the very first AFS group that went to Finland in 1960, and she lived with a Swedish-speaking family. So she had to learn both, Finnish and Swedish. She liked Swedish a lot better, but a lot of language acquisition data is collected in Finland for just this reason, because it's such a multilingual, multicultural country still. The same as, you know, the different regions in Spain. You do a lot of language acquisition data because they speak Spanish, but they also speak Catalan or Gallego or Valenciana, something like that. Yeah.
I guess it's not technically immigration related, but did you come across trends, and specifically local, I'm thinking as far as rises and falls in African American population in Yellow Springs?
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't related to foreign born, but when I was on council in the early 2000s, we did commission a study on population and specifically racial makeup of our local population through Wright State University, because at the time we were losing significant population and slightly more people of color than white residents were leaving. And the explanation at the time was during the 60s and earlier when there was a lot of redlining practices, that Yellow Springs was one of the few places that African Americans, they did for themselves, bought land and developed it and sold lots to their friends. Many of them were professionals. They were working at Wright-Patterson. So Yellow Springs was, again, a safe haven or a safe enclave where they could purchase land. But after the civil rights movement, suddenly they had a lot more choices. And we were not only losing population here, but we continued to lose businesses. And so without the employment, this is usually what people move for, is a job. And so if you don't have employment to offer, then they will go where they can get a better job. And just like newcomers, so they, you know, share that to some extent. There's a high level of entrepreneurship among immigrant communities, which is why Dayton became a welcoming city, because they were also losing employers at a rapid rate, and immigrant populations, unfortunately, because many of them do not have access to either education or getting re-credentialed in the U.S., then they have a much higher rate of entrepreneurship in order to support their families. So, and that is being borne out in the employment data in the Dayton area anyway.
Jocelyn, it's interesting. I did what you said as far as reading the census schedules for Yellow Springs from 1860, which is the first time there was any kind of detail given in the census, and it was listed as black or mulatto population of Yellow Springs in 1860 was 10%. So it was a relatively high percentage at that time even.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks were listed as coming from the south, but also a lot were from elsewhere in Ohio and the east too. So it wasn't all one thing.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised when we were doing the population review back in the early 2000s, that although we had lost population and also the proportion of people of color in the village, we were actually coming down to being in line with the diversity of the nation. So the U.S. as a whole is about 24–25% people of color, and Yellow Springs at that time had dropped down to that number. So it's still something about which I think our community is justifiably proud, but we're seeing a lot of pressures and change economically. The other thing I thought was interesting is that in the census data that I was looking in the 20s and 30s, everyone on the long form was listing their race as white, but there was a family from Ireland who had a wife who had put white and then in brackets below was corrected to black. So I don't know if that's a reflection of the drop of, anyway, another program for another day. But I thought it was interesting that there are still people of color, but maybe coming from countries which have not been acknowledged as being more diverse than we give them credit for being, in the UK especially, Germany as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.